And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Oscar Trimboli, all the way from Sydney, Australia. Oscar is a coach, a speaker, and the author of Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, the 125-400 Rule, the art and science of listening and breakthroughs. And I love one of the things I love about Oscar. He's got fairly mild goals. So he's on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world by the year 2030. So I don't want to keep him from that task for too long because that's a pretty monumental task. But welcome aboard. Thank you. Thank you for coming on today, Oscar.
Thanks for the opportunity to reach out and create a few more listeners today, Peter. 100 million is built sometimes one at a time, sometimes one podcast at a time. And sometimes you got to go really, really simple and small, and then you got to go really, really big. So I think balancing those two
Yeah.
out is always a paradox for me. There's the stage and platform, and then there's the one-on-one conversations, and being comfortable with both at the same time.
Yeah. No, great point. Tell me a little bit about sort of the business side of your world. So there's speaking work that you do, there's coaching work that you do, writing that you do, consulting. How does that balance out, and how do they all connect to deep listening?
Yeah, the big thing that speaking's the platform that drives that, and getting on a platform like a podcast, getting on a platform that's a stage, and getting on TV, and that starts the momentum typically to a client conversation. Somebody will typically not be the person watching or listening, but podcasts, for example, are really shareable platforms. They're very intimate. So when somebody shares a podcast with a CEO and says, you got to listen to this guy. And as a result, typically I'm brought in to speak at company kickoff meetings that set the tone for the beginning of the year. So a lot of organizations talk about being customer centric and listening to the customer, but none of them really know how to do it. So that then comes into a really simple diagnostic that I do with the organizational leadership team. And then that kind of rolls into a speech, typically rolls into a training program where I'm working with a leadership.
Boy, let me back you up for a moment there because I want to dissect this a little bit. So you said speaking's a big driver, but then you said that a diagnostic could lead into a speech, could lead into an intervention. Is there a typical, more classic linear? Does it start with speaking that someone sees you and brings you in? Does it start with the diagnostic, or are there multiple paths?
The three paths that are consistent: one, my own podcast; two, the speaking platform; and three, people are consuming my content. So I've got a very simple myths of listening checklist for people to go through, which is front and center on my website. And if I'm speaking at an event, that's the call to action. If I'm speaking on a podcast like this, oscartrimboli.com/listening myths. And that's pretty much the path to finding out about how to engage with me on that journey.
Got it. Got it. And what I was asking a bit is how it unfolds on the client side. Do you prefer starting with a keynote, or do you prefer starting with a diagnostic, or all roads lead to Rome? Does it not matter?
Here's three stories from real life examples. Example number one: a head of sales was listening to me on a podcast, and CEO got up on stage at a company kickoff meeting. There was about 900 people in the room, and basically the CEO talked about the importance of listening through to the audience for questions. And the head of sales said to the CEO, "You're the worst listener in this room. You should listen to this podcast from this guy called Oscar Trimboli." And the room did exactly what you did. It was done in a light-hearted, elegant way. The CEO listened to a couple of podcasts and said, "Can you come over?" This was in New Zealand. "Can you come over and speak to me and my leadership team? The mistakes you talk about, we're making all the time." So that led to a really simple engagement with the leadership team to go, you can preach all you want about listening, but you have to be role models of listening. So let's just work with you. So that's example number one. Example number two, I'm speaking at a public event. So I've been invited to speak at a risk managers conference. So these typically people big in financial services, the energy markets, they're managing very significant risk. I get up on stage, I talk about what they're not listening to. And as a result of that, for pretty much every 100 people that I speak to, I know that 15 will contact me and 5 will end up in assignment in the next 2 years time frame. So in that audience, there was about 80 people. I picked up 2 assignments out of that. One was to work with the chief risk officer to understand what she wasn't listening to personally, and then help her to create systems, processes to understand what they're not listening to from their employees around risk in their system. And then finally, my book. It's a really small book by design. It's 100 pages. It's designed to be read, not what I would call a dust collecting trophy on a shelf that nobody actually reads. And people are handing these books out to each other because they're so easy to access. It's almost written in a comic strip format where I've got some very deliberate graphical characters that people can relate to, and I talk about the four villains of listening, and they have characters that bring them to life. But the four villains allow people to self identify in a humorous way which one of the listening villains they are. And that becomes the shareability where people will say to their manager, you got to get this guy to come in and talk because you're the shrewd listener, or you're the interrupting listener, or you're the lost listener.
Got it. Good stuff. So let's talk a little bit about speaking, right? Because you're in Sydney, and that market's a little bit different. So tell us a little bit about how speaking plays into the mix for you, and how you prepare for speaking.
Yeah, so tomorrow I'll be speaking at a company kickoff. That was referred by somebody who'd heard me speak at a public event previously, and they've got their company kickoff meeting. They've got 90 people managers in a room, and once the formal kickoff with all the organization is complete, where they set the tone, the leadership team, as well as all the people managers in the room, I'll be speaking to them about what they're not listening to when it comes to customers and employees. So that's, you know, the more I speak, the more I get referred because the topic I speak about is very narrow and deliberately so. I'm easy to refer. I'm the listening guy. So I think for a lot of us, understanding how do we narrow the aperture on our camera to get our focus even narrower than we could think possible. So for me, going from being a generic coach supervisor to being somebody who's an expert in listening makes me very easy to refer when it comes to speaking gigs with speaking bureaus as well.
So, but let me hold you there for a second. So the reason, and I think this is an important point, that you're easy to refer is because all of your work, your brand, if I go to check you out, is all about you're the listening guy. You're the deep listening guy. So that when
Yep.
somebody is referring you in the space, they don't go and check you out, and you do a little bit of listening and a little bit of this and a little bit of negotiations. It's you're all deep listening all the time. So therefore, in the right situations, you're the perfect puzzle piece.
Yeah, so I would fit into a communication
Yes.
category typically, but typically the people that I'm not competing against another listening expert. I'm always competing against the speaking expert, the person who's going to help your audience be more articulate. And look, a lot of organizations, they do that year after year after year. And for me, when I'm in the briefing session and I know I'm competing against those, I was like, we've been learning how to speak for a century. How's that going for us? Because right now, the productivity hack of the 21st century is listening, it's not speaking. And if you want to understand your customers' problems more deeply, it's how you listen, not just to what they're saying, but to what they're not saying. And you can just see people nodding in the room and they go, yeah, we got to do something different. We got to try something different.
So, what are the other sort of flavors of listening? So, we talked about some consulting work, we talked about some speaking. Are there other programs or digital learning or other sorts of intervention where once somebody is exposed to you and your work, they say, wow, that's awesome. I wish I can bring this back to my team of 500 or 5,000?
Yeah. So if you think about listening is so ethereal, it's so abstract. So a lot of the work I do in the interventions is about making the intangible tangible. So I have a set of playing cards that people love. I have a jigsaw puzzle game that I use, and just great fun to watch adults regressing back into their childhood when they play jigsaw puzzles. And again, those really simple, tangible techniques where people go, you look at this card, you got to get this guy in. wow, we just did this jigsaw puzzle. It blew my brain how little I actually listen. And it's not enough to say he's the listening guy. It's not enough to say listening's different. You've got to give them something that makes you really easy to share. And I think in those physical artifacts, whether that's the book, whether that's the playing cards, whether that's the jigsaw puzzle, whether that's the podcast, whether that's a simple thing as your speaker show reel, if you're easy to share, you're easy to refer. Because the biggest problem we have is that the sale is not to the person who's seen us speak, it's how do we help them make the sale or at least the referral to the person who's going to buy you at the end of the day.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Are there what I was looking at a little bit is some of the specific uh, modalities. So you mentioned the card game, you mentioned the puzzles. Are all of the things that you do in order to bring listening to life, if you will, things that you present, or are there other ways that folks can consume it without you being part of the equation personally?
Yeah. So at this point in my practice journey, uh, I'm about 6 weeks out from completing an online course for coach consultants and other leaders who want to use the jigsaw puzzle, the playing cards, the books, and all the IP that I've developed in their leadership programs. I've got people from Canada, the US, England, all saying, can we Skype? Can we spend some time? I've heard about these cards. I've had one of my clients who's a global, literally go and evangelize this around the world. And a lot of them say, can you pop on a Skype and talk me through it? And eventually, I just went, wow, this is just incredibly time inefficient. So somebody suggested to me to build an online program
Sure.
for coach consultants. The other piece of work we're doing that's longer term to build 100 million deep listeners in the world is building an Alexa skill. So imagine you're walking into a meeting room and you say, hey, Alexa, listen to my next meeting and debrief me half an hour after its conclusion. And then Alexa will say, hey, Oscar, great meeting. At the 23-minute mark, you interrupted Peter. At the 30-minute mark, you should have paused a little bit longer because although they'd stopped speaking, they had drawn in breath. So you want to just pause there. At the 33-minute mark, you should have asked more how questions rather than why questions. Go and practice that next time. Tell me how you go. So we're
That's amazing.
and the
That's
the
amazing.
technology's here today. It's just really expensive. And what I'm working with is 2 universities to build a valid model to prove that the interventions will work. So we've got 1,400 people in a database of listeners that I've worked with over time to see if the interventions I've helped them with will help them to improve their listening, not just from their perspective, but we've also recruited some evaluators that are evaluating these people on their listening. Now, that journey, we've got the people in the database, but that will, before it becomes an Alexa skill, will become a mobile phone app. And before that will become a questionnaire assessment model so that people can kind of,
I love that. So, given that you're about to launch this suite of services and solutions, could you tell us a little bit around about the journey and the selection process that went into the thinking? Because you didn't just wake up one day and say, "I'm going to build this." How did you go about deciding, analyzing, and thinking what elements of your content to put into what modalities and what expectations your clients can have when they use it? Because there's one thing to have a world class expert in a room sitting across across the table from me directly versus putting that in a different format. So how did you go about that whole process before you even got into the product
Hmm.
development mode?
Yeah, so I've been deliberate to create a set of mentors around me that aren't commercially orientated. They're academics in this field, University of Missouri, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and from Oxford in the UK. And I'm kind of doing, I would feel like a commercial PhD, as in I'm not going to write a PhD that's going to be done by academics. So one of the things I'm consistent about with them is trying to prove that the way I'm teaching it is useful. So a simple example of this, Peter, was where did the playing cards came from? The playing cards came from a set of exercise that were originally just written on 3M sticky notes. And it was always done after the lunch break, but before the afternoon break. And what I noticed is, as people stuck these on the wall at the afternoon break, they'd kind of point to them and start talking to other people. And one afternoon tea break, I actually took them all off the wall, and two people came and said, "Can I have my card?" And I thought, wow, they're attributing a lot of meaning to this thing. I wonder what that's about. And all of a sudden, I realized we could make cards out of that. Literally, a playing card game emerged from client work. But then I went back to the academics and said, hey guys, in terms of this, how does this align with adult learning models? And they said, well, it's engaging all learning styles. That's why people love the exercise so much. It's engaging auditory, kinesthetic, and visual learners in a really deep and meaningful way, but you're also creating shared meaning in what you do. I would say this: everything that's been created, that's launched, has come from the client work that I've done. A lot of the academics keep saying to me, your stuff is so practical. What's the model behind it? And the model is lots and lots of consulting
Right.
assignments and me understanding that there's meta learning in everything. So I talk about the 5 levels of listening. The 5 levels of listening emerge from multiple one-on-one and group interventions where I try to understand, okay, what's the model that would sit behind that? And then under the 5 levels of listening, unpicking each level in a way that people could access visually, auditory, and kinesthetic. And then the journey now is, how do you do that in a more scalable way, one to many via online systems as well?
Got it. Got it. So I guess the short answer to that is the answer to figuring out how to deploy deep listening solutions is by listening deeply to your clients during your work with them and your consulting engagements with them. And I think that holds true, quite frankly, across all content, right? When you try to develop, when you try to create modalities of your content in isolation without talking to the market, without listening to the market, without understanding what the market needs, you wind up with a lot of stuff that doesn't go too far. So I love the way you're going about that. Given we're at that point where we need to start wrapping up here, could you give us two or three little nuggets, little tidbits of things to consider, things to take into account when you're building and scaling your content-based business?
Number one, it's a choice. You have to make a decision that you're going to allocate time in your calendar to content creation. So for me, deliberately putting time aside for writing book, for writing course outline. So number one is actually commit and decide that coding what you're going to do matters. And for some of us, that means software code, but for most of us, it just means writing it down. The second one is distribution. Think about how that is going to get out. Social's interesting, but it's not potent. It's all built, the distribution's built one on one, one to many, face to face, and on platforms like this. So you've really got to think
Right,
about, it's
right.
not enough just to create the content, is how you're going to distribute it through multiple modalities, whether that's by videos, whether that's by podcasts, whether that's by speaking engagements, whether that's by book authoring, whether that's by assessments. So distribution matters. So number one, commit and decide. Number two, think about distribution. And then number three, create a community. So for me, a lot of people interpret create a community as like a group in a platform like a Facebook or some kind of membership site. But equally for me, yes, that's true. But for me, it's having the conversations in communities face to face. And those communities for me are built in one to many training courses face to face, where I'm building community as part of the training course. So one of the things I always talk about in training is, you're going to leave here today feeling like you've had a wonderful warm bath. But tomorrow you're going to go out there and you're going to get dirty, and you're going to need a buddy to help you understand what you've forgotten from today and what you're strong at today. So always deliberate about building a buddy in the room to make sure that they can create a community outside the room, inside their own organization, as well as the online platforms as well. So they're the three things that I think about, Peter.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing that and all that you've shared with us today. I think it was a lot of knowledge coming across here and a lot of things that we can all learn from listening to the deep listener. So thanks for joining us today, Oscar. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.